Hey guys, welcome to Man Medicine, where we talk about how men can optimize their health and escape the collapsing U.S. healthcare system. Today we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about something that I've been thinking about quite a bit lately after some shifts in the emergency department. In the wintertime, especially currently, there's kind of a change in the profile of what I see on a daily basis. There's always the typical, there's heart attacks, there's strokes, skin and soft tissue infections. But we're in a season right now, obviously, and I'm sure you've seen this on the news, where we're seeing a ton of viral upper respiratory infections. There's a lot of influenza, RSV, and still some COVID going around. But one of the things that invariably happens in the holiday season is that there's an uptick in visits for mental health issues. Now, there's always this background of mental health issues that I see in the emergency department, regardless of the year or the season. Typically, at least from what I see, we're talking about there's a lot of substance related psychosis, mainly involving like alcohol, methamphetamines, that sort of stuff. But there is also an uptick in people with worsening major depression who are either reaching out for help or who are being brought in either by the police or by EMS after a suicide attempt, something like an overdose or some other act of self-harm. And that, is borne out statistically across the country, that there are more suicides and ER visits for mental health issues in the holidays. So that got me thinking a little bit about the role that testosterone therapy can play in addressing mental health issues. And I don't think this gets talked about very much, and so I thought I'd just cover some of the basic literature that's out there for you guys who have an interest in this. Now, all of us understand, I think at this point, certainly if you're on testosterone or if you go on any of the forums that are out there where the bros are talking about testosterone, we all know about some of the physical changes that can happen with testosterone. You may be familiar with some of the cardiovascular benefits, some of the improvements in things like insulin sensitivity, reductions in body fat, increases in skeletal muscle mass. But there are and can be some very profound changes in the central nervous system, especially related to mood. There are a lot of androgen receptors in the central nervous system, and so testosterone obviously crosses the blood-brain barrier and can have some pretty profound effects in some cases. So that's what I want to talk about with you guys today. So let's get into it a little bit. A little background on depression. So this is a chart showing the prevalence of major depression in U.S. adults. It's relatively common, 21 million adults, representing about 8.4% of all U.S. adults. It's a bit more common in women than it is in men. But the largest demographic that is affected by major depression is the young adult range. So we're talking about 18 to 25, as you can see from this chart. And this is individuals that meet diagnostic criteria for a major depressive episode. So I'll talk about what those criteria are. But there are a lot of people that suffer from kind of a low-grade depression, persistent depression, often referred to as dysthymia, which is vastly more prevalent than people that meet criteria for major depression. So there's a lot of people out there that are just sort of struggling at a low level. They may not meet the formal criteria for major depression, but they're still suffering and they're still living at a lower quality of life than they should be. And so I've always been curious about the role that testosterone can play in that, because in myself, I noticed, in fact, one of the biggest changes that I noticed when I started on testosterone therapy almost 10 years ago was an improvement in my mood. I didn't get the major physical changes that some of you guys may have experienced. Most of my benefits came in the realm of cognition and mood. So I was very happy with that. So this is the prevalence of major depression. I want to just talk about, basically what are the criteria that physicians use, specifically psychiatrists, to actually diagnose major depression. And I bring this up, I know it's a little bit tedious, but I bring it up because I think it's important. If you look through these 8 different criteria here, there's substantial overlap with the symptoms of low testosterone or hypogonadism. And so that's why it's really important to try to tease this out. It's been my clinical experience, and I've heard many stories from patients who for years have been suffering from either full-blown major depression or what sounds like dysthymia that really had hypogonadism. And once that was not only diagnosed, but then subsequently treated, they had massive improvements in their mood. And in some cases, were actually able to get off of antidepressants. So let's run through these real quick. This is the DSM-5, which is a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Every few years, they come out with a new one. We're currently on the 5th iteration. So depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. Oh, by the way, this has to be for at least like a 2-week period. So must have 5 or more symptoms of the following during the same 2-week period. And at least one of the symptoms should be either 1, depressed mood, or 2, loss of interest or pleasure. So first one, depressed mood, markedly diminished interest in pleasure in all or almost all activities. So normally stuff that like normally would have made you happy, you're just kind of not interested in it anymore. Significant weight loss when not dieting, or maybe I think more commonly weight gain, or a decrease or increase in appetite nearly every day. Slowing down of thought and a reduction of physical movement. So the technical term for this is psychomotor retardation. These people they're just less animated. Their faces are kind of flat, and they lose much of the previous animation and expression that they used to have. Fatigue or loss of energy, sound familiar? Feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt. Diminished ability to think or concentrate, indecisiveness. That's a testosterone related phenomenon that I have seen personally. And then recurrent thoughts of death, recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan or suicide attempt or specific plan for committing suicide. So, all right, DSM-5 criteria. So let's get into nitty gritty here. So this is the first paper I want to review with you guys from JAMA Psychiatry. Unlike some of the old dusty papers that I sometimes drag out for these talks, this one's relatively recent. It was published in JAMA Psychiatry in 2019, January. Association of testosterone treatment with alleviation of depressive symptoms in men. All right, this is a big systematic review and meta-analysis. It's a really like wide-ranging papers, but I'm just going to focus on some of the important details that I was able to glean from it. So they looked at 27 randomized controlled trials, almost 2,000 men, and they concluded essentially that testosterone treatment is associated with a significant reduction in depressive symptoms. It's important to say association does not equal causation. So I can hear some of you guys out there already getting your hackles up about that. So something can be associated, but it doesn't mean that it's causing it, okay? Probably one of the sillier, but also like best examples of that is an example I heard many, many years ago that eating popsicles is associated with sunburn. It's statistically that is a factual statement, but it's not that popsicles cause sunburn. It's just that you're more likely to eat popsicles in the summertime, maybe when you're out at the beach or the pool, in which case you're more likely to get a sunburn, okay? So association does not necessarily mean causation. Now it might, but it doesn't always mean that. So I think you should whenever you hear the word or the term that something is associated with something else, I want you to immediately think association does not mean causation necessarily, and that's important to remember, with this paper and any of the subsequent ones I'm going to show you. Okay, they said testosterone therapy was generally well tolerated. Some interesting things from this, though. They obviously looked at studies with a variety of different doses of testosterone, and interestingly enough, like some of them went up to 500 milligrams a week of testosterone, which is clearly like well beyond the TRT range. I mean, that's like you are solidly juicing at that point. But interestingly enough, the higher the dose, there tended to be like incremental benefits in mood, even like up into the 500 milligram range. So I'm certainly not endorsing testosterone dosages that high because you're more than likely going to run into a lot of other adverse effects. But I just found it interesting that there didn't seem to be an obvious ceiling where there was no further benefit as the dose went up. It just kind of continued to slowly go up based on the dose. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So their conclusion was testosterone treatment appears to be effective and efficacious in reducing depressive symptoms in men, particularly when higher dose regimens were applied in carefully selected samples. Yeah, absolutely. A couple other things that were interesting about this in addition to the dose. Now, some of the other studies with testosterone therapy showed that the men that benefited the most were men who met criteria for classical hypogonadism. So men with obviously like the very lowest testosterone levels, either free testosterone or total. And then some of these studies showed less or no benefit in men with normal testosterone levels, or maybe like testosterone levels in the bottom, like 1/3 or bottom quartile, although who were still technically in the normal range. But this study was interesting, or this meta-analysis, they concluded actually that wasn't necessarily the case. They said, remarkably, initial testosterone status was not a moderator of the effect of testosterone treatment on depressive symptoms. So basically what they showed was that people with objective hypogonadism, very low testosterone levels benefited clearly, but also men with normal testosterone levels who were suffering from depressive symptoms also seemed to be benefiting from testosterone. So I found that kind of interesting. You don't necessarily have to meet classic like endocrine society criteria for hypogonadism to potentially benefit from testosterone, at least according to this meta-analysis. The other thing that was interesting too is there didn't seem to be an age cutoff. So young men in their 20s benefited just as much as older men, in their 60s and beyond in terms of mood. There didn't seem to be a big difference there. So testosterone helped both of those groups. Now, this is a really important conclusion that they came up with, and I'm going to summarize it here. But basically, when it came to like severe depression, severe major depression, certainly like depression with psychotic features, that sort of thing, the benefit of testosterone didn't really seem to be there, or was like relatively negligible. But the men who did seem to benefit the most were men with sort of less severe subclinical depression, with dysthymia, as I was mentioning earlier. So that kind of low-grade depression, those men seem to do better, or seem to have a better response to testosterone. So it may be that that's the group that maybe testosterone therapy should be looked at a bit more closely, and then men with like much more severe depression, fixing their testosterone level is not going to cure them of their depression. But there seems to be some inkling based on this meta-analysis that maybe men with kind of low-grade depression, in fact they mention in here that maybe testosterone could be considered as monotherapy for these men in terms of their low-grade depression, which I thought was fairly profound. I certainly would feel better about putting a man on a TRT regimen than I would prescribing them a lifelong course of like SSRIs or other antidepressants, because those have a host of side effects as well. So the other thing that they mention, and I have seen this in clinical practice over and over and over again, is that the effects on a person's or man's mood when they start testosterone, it happens pretty quickly. And to be honest with you, I noticed this myself. It was actually within a matter of a week I started to feel better. But typically they say within 3 to 6 weeks, you should start seeing mood improvements that slowly continue, and then they might generally peak by like 6 months, okay? So, I think it's safe to say then, if you've reached the 6-month point and you're not having an improvement in mood, you're not going to get one, at least according to these studies. So, and if you're just taking testosterone for the mood enhancing benefits by 6 months, if you're not feeling better, you may want to consider like discontinuing it at that point, unless you're getting some other benefit, which quite frankly most men do. So, how does testosterone work in the brain? It's still being worked out. It's pretty interesting. So I want to show you another paper here. This is Impact of Exogenous Testosterone on Mood, Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis of Randomized Placebo-Controlled Trials, Annals of Clinical Psychiatry. So they dive a little bit into the mechanism in this paper. And, almost all of these studies come from lab rats. There's a few primate studies. So, take that for what it's worth. There may be similar mechanisms in humans, or they could potentially be quite different. But it's important to remember, I think of testosterone as a prohormone. A prohormone meaning that it is a precursor. It gets converted into two hormones, primarily, estradiol and DHT, of which throughout the brain there are copious amounts of estrogen receptors and androgen receptors. So the mood effects that we're seeing with testosterone may, in fact, have a lot to do with their conversion to both of those substances. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So, it seems totally plausible that, a man with low testosterone a lot of times will also have low estrogen, unless they're just morbidly obese. And it may be the estradiol effect that is making their depression or their mood worse. Because we do know that estrogen replacement in women does seem to help with depressive symptoms. Okay. They tend to have less depression and mood disorders than postmenopausal women who are not on HRT. Okay, that's a whole different talk. Not going to happen on this channel. This is Man Medicine. All right. So this is a picture of the brain, and this is the areas of the brain where estrogen receptors are the most concentrated. So it's pretty widespread, right? So your temporal cortex, your hippocampus, hypothalamus, thalamus, amygdala, the frontal cortex, parietal cortex, all like critical areas for higher executive functions, for mood, and a host of other bodily functions. Okay, you need estradiol, and it's important to state that these aromatase inhibitors that seem to be so popular in some of these TRT windmill clinics, they do cross the blood-brain barrier, and they have direct effects in the brain. The aromatase enzyme is very prevalent within the CNS, and so testosterone does get directly converted into estradiol in the brain itself. And it's well documented that estrogen has neuroprotective effects within the brain. So yet another reason, in my opinion, to stay away from aromatase inhibitors if at all possible. And then finally, in this paper, they talk about, in addition to what I just mentioned, there seems to be some effect in the GABA system, which I'm not going to get into in general, but the GABAergic properties of the brain or of testosterone tend to have a calming effect. I think that's probably I'm just going to leave it at that because it's actually quite complicated. And in clinical practice, that's actually what I've noticed too, is that contrary to what the media tells you about testosterone causing anger, rage, emotional lability, that stuff, what I have seen personally and what I've experienced myself is a bit of a calming effect when men with low testosterone are treated back up to normal levels. And that has a lot to do possibly with interaction with this whole GABA system within the brain. The other mechanism that I think probably has the most impact on depression is the effects on the serotonin system within the brain that testosterone has. So this is a super interesting paper here from Reviews in Endocrine and Metabolic Disorders. This is a fresh one off the press, 2022. The role of testosterone, the androgen receptor, and the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis in depression in aging men. Pretty cool paper. I'm not going to go into the androgen receptor stuff because I'm actually going to do another talk on that. I think that understanding how the androgen receptor works and the variations in the androgen receptors that all of us may or may not have, it plays a really profound role in how men respond to testosterone. And I think it has a lot to do, in my opinion, of why some men do really well on testosterone therapy at a certain dose and some other men do not. So we'll talk about that at a different time. Without belaboring and getting into too much detail, the dysfunction within the serotonin system of the brain is thought to be one of the primary mechanisms that mediates depression. That theory has spawned a whole class of drugs called SSRIs, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Things like Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro, Celexa, the list goes on. They are commonly prescribed, arguably overprescribed in my opinion, for depressed mood, major depression, OCD, anxiety, etc. But regardless, the serotonin system is crucially important within the brain. And interestingly enough, testosterone plays a really important role in that. So what this paper says here, it says testosterone treatment upregulates serotonin transporter expression and increases the firing rate of serotonergic neurons. Okay, which has been proposed as a mechanism to promote the antidepressant action of testosterone. It also upregulates serotonin 5-HT4 receptors within the brain. So upregulates receptors, increases serotonin levels, and that's the going theory right now in terms of how testosterone seems to affect mood. So pretty interesting. So yeah, it's not an SSRI necessarily, but it certainly interacts with the serotonin system. And this is what I find interesting about this. And I think this explains why many men who are on SSRIs in some cases can decrease the dose of their SSRI once they're on testosterone and continue to feel good. And then in some cases I've seen actually been able to come off of their SSRI and just use and remain on like testosterone monotherapy and still have significant improvements in their mood, because both clearly affect the serotonin system within the brain. So just an interesting thought. So to wrap this up, depression is really common, low testosterone is really common, but unfortunately I don't think that many men especially who are diagnosed with depression, with dysthymia, have had physicians who have bothered to check to make sure that they're not suffering from like profound hypogonadism, which according to the literature, there's a good chance that may be playing a part in how they're feeling. And it also obviously presents an opportunity to potentially help these men. So there are opportunities here to either avoid antidepressants entirely in some cases, or potentially, either only use one antidepressant or perhaps a low dose of a single antidepressant as opposed to multiple antidepressants, which is something that I see not infrequently, both in men and in women. So I just, and to be fair, like I wasn't trained in medical school or in either of my residencies to check that box. In hindsight, I feel bad about this, but 15, 20 years ago, I would hand out SSRIs, I think like a lot of primary care doctors, not quite like candy, but, perhaps, a little bit more liberally than I would at this point. And I certainly never checked testosterone levels before doing that. I never checked thyroid levels. I never, looked for other potentially contributing factors within the endocrine system. And I feel bad about that, but I don't do it anymore. All right, guys, I hope you have good holidays, and we'll catch you next time. All Man Medicine video and audio has been created and shared online for informational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute the practice of medicine or professional healthcare services of any kind, including the giving of medical advice. I am not your doctor. No doctor-patient relationship has been established. This content is not meant to be a substitute for professional medical advice and should not be relied upon solely for that purpose either. The only purpose of this content is to present peer-reviewed, research-backed health information for your consideration. As always, rely on the advice and guidance of your personal physician before undertaking any activity presented here, and if in doubt or not comfortable with said activity, practice discretion. Your health is your responsibility and not ours. Finally, I take conflicts of interest seriously. I accept no compensation whatsoever from any private corporations, including pharmaceutical or supplement companies. You can trust that if I recommend a medication, product, or service, it's because I genuinely believe in it and not because I'm being paid to endorse it.